Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb Riff. My name is Patrick Lovell, and I am recording this on Sunday, April 6th at approximately 10 a.m. my time. And my mind is swimming with both imagery and thoughts and sounds of yesterday, and really sounds and thoughts and imagery of the last 14 years, kind of encapsulated in this whole thing, or I should say blended in this whole thing. Yesterday was a prolific day in context to the nationwide rallies that were affiliated with the hands-off protests organized initially, I believe, by an outfit called 50501. And I'm just learning a little bit about those guys. They were also involved with Indivisible and I'm sure some others, but I attended here in my neck of the woods with my colleague, Roseanne Rabiel Amelie. We had a phenomenal day. It was a beautiful day. It was one of the most extraordinary days, and maybe one of the most extraordinary confluence of days. Like several days ago, and I happened to post this on my social media, I was snowboarding, and I frequently snowboard because I live near the mountains, and where I live, the snow is some of the best snow on earth. And I just happened to post that, when I die and go to heaven, I don't know if it's going to feel as good as powder where I live. And it was an extraordinary sort of, for me, when you get those moments in nature, when everything comes together just so perfectly, you feel like you're complete zen is what it comes down to. And you're connected. And I have found the last few days, I've been in that sort of thing. I'm not trying to force my way through things. I'm not trying to, you know, be anywhere other than where I am, and I'm going with the flow. But I'm riding it in a really, really cool, dynamic way. And I'd say that just bled into the last couple of days, particularly what happened yesterday. I mean, it was so extraordinary, so beautiful. First, the weather was perfect. It was a bluebird sky day with the snow-capped mountains in the background. And where I live, there was 10,000 plus people that showed up, and it was magnificent. Now, I had thought that I would go and do my own truth bomb riff to people that were arriving because I had unfortunately not connected with the organizers. And I'll tell you why this is important because I reached out to the group, the Utah chapter of 50501, and the only thing I could find on them was through Instagram. And so I reached out and I reached out, and at first I introduced myself as a filmmaker. I dropped my um, trailer to the con. And if you're just seeing me now, if you're new to me on Blue Sky, I am a producer. I'm a producer with the $71 trillion truth and the revelations of how this whole system works so that we can turn the tables on this. And I've been involved with this, with these truth bomb riffs that are part lecture, part sermon, part self-help therapy, quite frankly, dealing with all of these things. But, and I thought that was really played out in some of these brilliant signs I saw created for the protest yesterday, where many of them were basically saying everything that I've been saying through these truth bomb riffs for now 3 years. And I think I'm north of 551. I don't know what the exact count is, but it's quite a bit over the course of 3 years. And yeah, there I was staring at 10,000 plus people with these incredible signs that were reflecting their sort of everything. Like one person had said something, I'm so furious about so many things it can't fit on the sign, sort of thing. And it went on from there. And the signs were absolutely creative. And so I had tried to make a connection with the organizers, and I wanted to learn a little bit more. And I was going to try to position myself to be in a scenario where I might be one of the speakers. And I reached out, and the first message that I sent, I introduced myself as a filmmaker. And I could tell right away the sense was on the other side of whoever was reading these emails that they probably thought that I was going to request documenting them behind the scenes and everything else, and what they were involved with. And they probably had all sorts of plans and they want to control the message. And I'm sure there's a lot of conversations about what they can and can't do, so they were probably going to be careful before they responded to me. Not to mention, considering the Trump administration and everything that's going on, I think that they do have to be very careful that they're not being contacted by, I don't know, some sort of ICE, depiction that's going to be fomenting at the moment at the FBI that's going to, target all of the organizers of these movements around the country. I could see that being a concern, for example. And so they didn't get back to me, but I had to be a little bit persistent, and I always am in pretty much everything I do. And that's why I'm a producer, because producers have to be persistent. And I'm also a muckraking journalist, and journalists have to be persistent. And so I was persistent, and I sent a number of emails and or messages on Instagram, and I got this message back eventually that said, "We only communicate on Signal." So I'm okay. I'll do that. And I think actually I got that message late on Friday night. And so I was like, shucks, I'm not going to be able to really, do what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was I wanted to talk to the point person, maybe talk to all of the organizers, introduce who I am and what I've got and why they would want to consider putting me in their lineup of whomever they were choosing to be as their speakers. And when you consider all of those sort of dynamics, you have to understand also where they're getting support from. Okay, these are the things that go through my mind because I understand structure, I understand organization. I've been in organizations, I've been in companies, I know how people work. I've been alive for 56 years, and yeah, it's just what we do as humans within trying to get things done, right? And so when you have those answers, you get to understand perspectives. Now, that was important to me because the information that I have is the answers that they're all looking for, that you're all looking for, that everyone around the country is looking for, and still can't quite see the forest for the trees. And I'll get to that. But so I show up with my colleague. I've got my bullhorn and I've got some things in my mind that I'm going to say, but I also want to kind of like walk around the grounds and kind of get a sense of how things are laying up. And it was much bigger than I had anticipated. Again, like I said, it was absolutely beautiful. And I'm kind of walking around the grounds of the state capitol. And I was fortunate that I got a pretty sweet parking spot, just being at the right place at the right time, kind of going back to my modality at the beginning that I've been in this sort of zen, just going with the flow, right? So I wasn't trying to get out over my skis, so to speak, which is a metaphor that we use when you have a long experience in the mountains. When you get out of balance, you're going to go down and you're going to roll and you're going to wipe out and yard sale and all of those things. And so I was just like, I'm going with the flow. I'm just going to figure it all out and see what it's all about. I'm going to feel my way through it. And so right away, there's a podium at the top of the stairs, which I'd kind of anticipated because I'd been to protest there before. And so I walked up and I'm just keeping my eyes open, looking around. And the first person that shows up to get on the microphone to kind of do sort of an introduction and welcome and, kind of a layout of what the event is going to be and that sort of thing, I recognized might be the person I had contacted on Instagram via Signal. Okay. And I could tell she was really busy. And I was kind of thinking, I don't want to rush her. I don't want to do this because obviously she's got a lot going on and there's a plan. But at the same time, I can tell that this is going to be a big event. And I want to try to see if I can get an opportunity to say what I'm about to say here. And I say pretty much every single day on my truth bombs, which if you want to go back through them, you can certainly sort through that. But it's important to kind of use this as a sort of evolution because of everything that we're all in the midst of. But she was a little bit panicked, as I could tell, and I could tell in her eyes. And she had a black face mask on, and she was wearing pretty much all black, as I recall. And she had these piercing green eyes. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. And I'm trying to gauge her age. And her age is like, I'm going to say maybe late 20s, early 30s. And so immediately my mind's processing what she knows, who she knows, why she's in the position she's in, what brought her here. And I'm just basically backtracking the last 10 years of people that I know that are activists and kind of filling in the blanks of just common sense sort of equations that you kind of have to sort through. But at the same time, I had to press the issue a little bit. And I was with my colleague again, Roseanne Rabiella Mille. For those of you who see me on blue sky, and anybody who's known me for the last several years realizes that Roseanne's been my partner in crime, and she is a force of nature. She's a very petite, 5'2", I believe, Italian, Sicilian, American from Chicago. Very, very intelligent woman. I found her initially through the MMT sort of apparatus because I went to a conference in Albany, New York at I think it's City University of New York. SUNY. Sorry if I screwed that up. But anyway, that's where we met originally about 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, now that I think about it. And she got on board and helped me facilitate this podcast that I did with one of her colleagues at the time that many people know, a guy by the name of Steve Grumbine. And we did a podcast that had to piece together all of the information that I had for season 2 of The Con that I couldn't get made because I ended up getting quashed by the Borg. And by the Borg, I mean the Borg, the most powerful organizations in the United States, the most powerful companies, the most powerful intelligence, all of it. The Borg of corruption. There's a reason I use that terminology. So Roseanne is a powerhouse and she knows how to make things happen. And so we were side by side and we approached this woman and I was going to, see if I could get like 30 seconds of her time. She was more backed up than I had known. And she had a lot going on and she just really had no tolerance for me. And here I am, I'm a white guy, I'm a middle-aged guy. I'm a white guy that she's probably dealt with working. Who knows what the psychology was, the perception, but she really wasn't interested in talking to me. I guess in her mind, maybe she thought, hey, I reached out to you on Signal late last night. You didn't call me then, we're not going to talk now, sort of thing. And I think in the melee of it all, because of all the chaos, I think I said something like, God, she just doesn't get it. She just, and in my mind, I'm thinking about all of the things that I have to think about all the day, which is really the sum total of what we're about to kind of touchstone upon. And justifiably, and I understand, she was frustrated with me and she just started to basically run to other things that she had to do. Okay. I mean, in a very, quick way, right? And rather aggressive, to be honest with you. And it was brilliant because my colleague Roseanne approaches her and says, hey, look, I'm 75 years old. I've been through this since the 60s. This might be my last time to address a group, and I've got important information that you need to hear. I can do it in 30 seconds. Now, I didn't know that's what she said because there was too much noise around me and everything else. But I was like, I was frustrated myself. But suddenly, this woman behind the black mask, who's the organizer for the 50501 with 10,000 people in front of us, takes Roseanne by the hand and leads her to the podium. And Roseanne just riffs this really fantastic truth bomb. But there was not enough time to get the context out there and everything else. But she really delivered an absolutely brilliant way. And I'm going to include in the link below here or in the description below her here a link to her speech, if you want to call it that. And she delivered, and it was fantastic. And then it was off to the races with all of the other speakers, and I was right behind the podium the whole time. And I just so desperately wanted to get the information to the 10,000 people in front of me and the tens of millions of people out there, which again is what I've been doing on a daily basis is now for 3 years plus, and it's growing, but it's not growing fast enough, and yet it's part and parcel to this whole thing that took place yesterday. And so, just for some perspective, for those of you maybe listening to me for the first time, my first documentary film. Now, before I get to that, I want to backwind. I've been a producer for 2 decades. I do a lot of stuff in action sports. I've done music. I've done entertainment. I've worked for Warner Brothers and Paramount. I've been on the sets of big films. I've worked for some of the biggest executive producers in the business. I've been around the block. I've produced features on some of the most well-known Hollywood talent in the history of Hollywood. I've worked with, among others, Keanu Reeves, Robert Redford, Meryl Streep, Jennifer Aniston, I could go on and on. And musical acts like Green Day and Metallica and the Grateful Dead. And I could go on and on with that as well. So, I've been around doing things at the highest levels, not to mention, working on a nationally syndicated television show that reached 97% of the United States. And I interact with a lot of people that a lot of you know who are very famous. Okay. That's my day job. That's what I do. I do that in addition to some other things, but that's primarily what I do. But my activism comes from as a result of what happened in the 2008 great financial crisis. I had lived through my own absolute rug pull where my life was turned upside down, like tens of millions of people in the United States. And I embarked on my first documentary as a result of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so my colleague and I were able to put together a deal where we went out and did a documentary on what was happening in the country. Our primary focus wasn't the Occupy Wall Street movement. Our primary focus, what was happening in the United States that lent itself to create the backlash and the impetus for hundreds of thousands of people to protest nationwide in what was a relatively short lifespan, if you will. And then it embarked on many other things, including creating really Bernie Sanders, if you want to know the truth, or at least on a national scale. But Occupy was an important thing. Occupy was incredible. In fact, my colleague and I are revisiting it now, and he's going to put together a lot of our footage that we had from that time period because he's involved with this new launch that I'm going to help promote as well that I'm involved with called Corruption Incorporated, which is kind of a sum total of this journey that we've been on because we've got incredible information. But at that time period, we had basically surfed the Occupy Wall Street wave, going back to the idea of being Zen and going with the flow. We got in our car, we got our cameras, we got our recording equipment, we got the budget, and we basically went from where I live in the Rocky Mountains up into the Northwest, all the way down the West Coast, all the way down to the SoCal region, and then we made our way back east, through the Great Southwest, through the Great Heartland, and up through the Rust Belt, and into the corridor between DC and New York City. We did that in a time span of, I believe we got on the road the day Occupy started, which was September. I'm getting these two prolific dates mixed up. It's September 17th, 2011. And I was mixing that up with September 15th of 2008 because that's when the world went upside down because of the great financial crisis, which led us all to come out to the streets at that time. And when we got on the road on September 17th, 2008, and headed to Seattle and then Portland and San Francisco and Los Angeles and so on and so forth, we were basically trying to piece together what my experience was with the general kind of experience of my colleague and I, experience in life based on what we know through our education and living in our understanding of the United States and what was actually happening at that time. And then we were learning through Occupy. And the thing that we were learning through Occupy that was the most important thing at that time was the 99%, the disparity of wealth. Now, interestingly, at that time period too, I had made a stop in Topeka, Kansas. And by the way, this whole thing was the Wizard of Oz journey. And by the time we got to Washington, D.C. and New York, that was literally unveiling Oz. But ironically, we made two stops in Kansas. One was, I think it was in Topeka, Kansas, and I can't remember the other town where the actual Frank Lloyd Baum Museum is, and he's the gentleman who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And I should tell you this story. This is pretty freaking fascinating. Oh my God. Yeah, I really do need to say this part of it. So I wanted to so the idea was kind of putting together from my narrative, the understanding of what happened to the American dream. And I wanted to connect with people that I knew, with experts out there, with all the people at Occupy and everything else, just to try to get a composite of what was happening in our country. And the film ultimately became Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. I don't know. I think we might re-release it. You can check it out on Google if you want to take a look at the images. You'll see our poster, which is amazing. The company that we had designed this distribution company did this poster that has the Statue of Liberty basically hanging a for sale sign. And we did that in 2011, but we didn't distribute it until 2013. We started making it at the end of 2011, and then we distributed it in 2013. But on this part of the journey, a couple of things that were so interesting. The night before, first of all, if you've ever been to Kansas, the sky looks like it goes on forever, but at the same time, the sky feels like you're in one of those snow globes. It feels kind of it's weird. It's this juxtaposition because you don't have any reference like I do with mountains. You know where north, east, south, and west is, but in the heart belt, you've got farmland as far as the eye can see, and the sky feels like it's kind of like on top of you. Of course it is, but in a way that it doesn't feel like out west. All right, out west it's more expansive, but for some reason it's just had a completely peculiar feel. And the reason I say that was because the night that I'm talking about had this incredible storm, and there were these lightning bolts, and I could have sworn that there was going to be a tornado, and it was just also metaphorical to the journey that I was on, which was like I said, it was this metaphor for the Wizard of Oz, and I had known a little bit about the corollary between I think it was the robber barons at the time and the battle to move off the gold standard into the silver standard, and what that meant for financing farms that were going bankrupt at the time because this was like late 1800s through the early 1900s, which by the way created the Federal Reserve at that time. And so this guy Frank Lloyd Baum was in the middle of all that, and he wrote The Wizard of Oz as a you know. I want to call it a metaphor, but it's an allegory. That's what it was. And we wanted to take a stop at this Wizard of Oz museum, and so we took a stop there, and we talked to the person who was in charge of the museum to kind of get some insights into who Frank Lloyd Baum was and what the whole story was and the allegories and everything else. And it was brilliant. But what I found was, and we shot this on camera, that absolutely, I'm thunderstruck at the moment remembering it. The original manuscript was in the World Trade Center, in a basement, in a museum on display. And for some reason, there was something that took place because they opened up this new museum. The museum at the World Trade Center had sent the original manuscript to the Topeka Museum, or this one in Kansas. I'm confusing where I was because I'm going to tell you this next aspect about what happened in Kansas on that leg of the journey. But they sent it on September 10th, 2001, a day before 9/11. And so I was profoundly shocked by that because at the time of 2007, 8, 9, and through 11, we were still close to 9/11 in the back, the rearview mirror, right? And one of the things that I was just so blown away with as we were going into this emotional journey, because I had my life rug pulled and devastated, and there was just so much pressure because I had my family, and life was so important to me, success was so important to me, the American dream was so important to me, but it had all been completely decimated by the great financial crisis. And here I was looking at and in my mind the whole time I was using these sort of corollaries to all of things 9/11 as kind of this analogy. And there I was looking at and learning about the economic really understructure that undergirded what the story was, the Yellow Brick Road, when Frank Lloyd Baum wrote it. And I was looking at the original manuscript. And so I was kind of like, wow, man, talking about being in the zone and feeling zen. And the reason that was so important to me, because principally my ethics, my ethos, my whole declaration of being is the entirety of the idea of the United States and the American dream. Separation of powers, the law above all else, integrity, courage, and commitment. Those are the kinds of things that I sort of infuse and embody, and that's what I have my entire life, and that's what I lived with. And so there I was looking at the original manuscript. And so the next day, after all of that took place. In fact, the weather was pretty gnarly that night as well. And you got to understand, when we were doing this road trip, we were going from occupy encampment to occupy encampment. We're on the road. We were going 24/7, nonstop. I mean, literally, there wasn't a second to breathe and think and do. We were just going all out gangbusters. And I was producing on the road. I was trying to figure out what the story was on the road. And one of the big stories also was this confluence at the time of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was it seemed organized structure-wise by Americans for Prosperity. And Americans for Prosperity were being funded, puppeteered, engineered, whatever you want to put, or however you want to think about it, by the Koch brothers. Now, I'd known a lot about the Koch brothers before that. Obviously, I'd known about the libertarian think tank all the way back to the 80s and David and Fred Koch and, the brothers and the dad's relationship with Stalin and how they were able to manifest their billions and billions and billions of dollars initially through fossil fuel, through the Soviet Union, which I always thought was incredible. But then the older I got, I realized that not Putin, there's a faux pas, Stalin wasn't a communist, really. I mean, I guess, it depends on what your version of communism is, right? But yeah, was it the workers and the proletariat and all of those things and the Lenin Revolution? And yeah, but it was still the Politburo, which is central rule and authority. And if you weren't on the same page with Putin, you were dead, basically. So authoritarian, right? And millions and millions and millions of people died. So a little bit of an offshoot with that. But I go back to that reference because of the Koch brothers, because Fred Koch was side by side with Putin, by the way. And then, of course, his sons are, very involved with tinkering around with the psychology and the methodology and the engineering and the politics of everything that underscore what their libertarian vision was, which underscores Project 2025 because they created the Heritage Foundation, which goes right to the unitary presidency. What we're all in the midst of this, 50501 hands off because of the authoritarian president. Okay. But I digress because all of this has to fit into whoever out there is listening to this to understand the composite of what I'm delivering. Okay. So I have this opportunity for my film to interview the guy who was the top PR spokesperson for, at that time, the Americans for Prosperity, which created the Tea Party. And I wanted to get into this fundamental conversation with him and be able to understand the forces that were undergirding Occupy Wall Street and what they were revealing and championing and protesting and being in the midst of, and then what the Tea Party was in the midst of, okay? And how these guys in the midst of it all were basically puppeteering it all, because I knew they were funding it. I knew they were financing it. And this guy who had this aw shucks sort of personality, this aw shucks kind of like, humble Kansas roots kind of guy, what's important to people who, live by the earth, farmers and, in their community and faith and, their patriotism and everything that is red, white, and blue, that they, put their hands over their hearts during the national anthem and, and they want freedom. They want liberty. Now, as it turns out, freedom and liberty for the Koch brothers to have complete control for their, fossil fuel apparatus, in addition to all of the other things that the Koch brothers are involved with, which include the largest timber company, I think, in the United States and probably one in the world, but one of the top ones in the world, Georgia Pacific, among other things that the Koch brothers are involved with. I think by the time both Koch brothers died, they were worth $40 billion apiece. They're one of the most heavyweight billionaire apparatuses and the smartest, quite frankly, that the United States has ever produced, because the Koch brothers not only had Americans for Prosperity that created the Tea Party, but they also had George Washington University. They have a whole array of think tanks, Heritage Foundation being one, and then they created echo chambers, which would lead to this guy whose name eludes me at the moment, who's the author of Project 2025, who's in the Trump administration, and we don't call it, and I saw this sign yesterday during the 50501, we don't call it a cabinet, we call it a junk drawer, of course. And, and I was sitting across from this guy, and he had a PhD from Harvard. And I think he had an MBA from Harvard as well. Or maybe it was Princeton. It was total Ivy League guy. This guy was a powerhouse. And I wouldn't put it past him if he was like, a BA in psychology. And that's who these guys hire to orchestrate all of these things that have manifested. And so I was going toe to toe with this guy, mano a mano. And I'll never forget, I had this hat and I had a Dead Kennedy t-shirt on while I was talking to this guy, And by the way, that was cool because I saw the signs yesterday at 50501 were fantastic. And one of the signs I saw were Nazi punks, fuck off. which was fantastic. And that's a song by the Dead Kennedys, right? And so that's kind of my come from. I'm an old skater, punk rock guy, full on slam dance, mosh pot guy, mosh pit. Grew up with Joe Strummer from the Clash. This is like sort of my thing. But I've always been an entrepreneur at the same time, right? So I believe in dynamism. Do I know all of the isms? I studied political science. Yeah, I worked in Hollywood. Do I know all of the isms? Socialism, fascism, capitalism, all the rest? Yes, I do. I know them quite well and their constructs. And I can tell you this, based on everything that I've been telling you for however many truth bomb riffs this is in context of 50501, it doesn't matter what ism it is. If you don't have integrity of that system, you have corruption. And there I was in Kansas at that time, right after seeing the Frank Lloyd bomb, original manuscript from The Wizard of Oz that escaped 9/11. And there I was talking to him, and I was off to the next thing. And that's just all perspective, right? And so as I get on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, one of the stops before I got to the final corridor during Occupy Wall Street was we went to Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And my colleague Eric was filming me. And, again, we were just winging it on the fly and everything else. And I was really kind of emotionally caught up in the whole thing because we had spent, imagine, from, the Northwest all the way down the West, all the way, from the Rocky Mountain region, all the way through the Southwest, all the way through the Rust Belt or the Midwest and, the flyover country, and then into the Rust Belt, into the final corridor. I had really been taking a lot of America with me at this point and everything that I was learning. And my structure too, which was my family structure and my background, and really what was undergirding this whole thing, which was the nature of power. I was really fully understanding the nature of power because at 413, Waking Up the American Dream, was prologue to the con. And it was remarkable in so much that, again, my father was a corporate attorney, my grandfather for a large natural gas company, huge natural gas company. He was James Bond. He used to fly around on Learjets to Paris, and he'd work on tankers all around the world and lobbying in Washington, D.C., and all that sort of thing. So that's what I grew up with. My grandfather was an independent oil man. He was a Texas oiler. He was yeah, he was an oiler. And I was an oiler growing up in terms of I was a Houston Oiler fan. But sorry, my voice is getting, I'm going to push pause for just a second. The word I was looking for, he was definitely a Texas Oiler, but he was a wildcatter, which means he was a guy that would, get investment guys together and they'd go drill holes. And, if more hit than didn't, then they made money. And sometimes they made a lot of money. So that's the kind of background that I came from. On the one hand, kind of those are the two biggest influences in life. My life plus my mom, who is a wonderful human being and had the empathy of the world. But my grandfather was a gambler, basically, and he wasn't afraid to take risks. And he was a big time golfer. And he reminded me of George Burns and Winston Churchill. And he used to always say that, he said, I always love the Rocky Mountains, the 4th of July, and Manhattan because you're always looking up. That was his sort of motif, right? And that's kind of how I was inspired. And that's kind of what I was carrying with me on my first feature film that I was making. And I was taking all of this with me and all of these lessons, but the question that I was constructing in my mind was organization of power. And I had known, because of my dad's background, the nature of corporate power. I understand board of directors. I understand CEOs. I understand the sort of, all the different financing mechanisms and all of those things. I mean, by the time I went on this journey, I just turned 40 years old. It's a long time ago. Actually, that's when 2008 hit. It was 14, 13 years ago. It's really 13 years ago. And I'm now 56 years old. But so I go through this whole situation where we get to Shanksville, and I was inspired for some reason because of the courage of Flight 93 and what those guys did to take down, as opposed to, flying into the Capitol, I think was the final target on that fateful day. And I remember, was it Tim Beamer who said, let's ride? And they hijacked the cockpit. They didn't sit down and they didn't take it and they didn't fly into the World Trade Center and they didn't fly into the Pentagon. They flew it right into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And so I was incredibly inspired by that. And it was a really, really foggy day. It was a rainy day. It was a cold day. It was in November. Yeah, it was kind of a miserable day. And I remember driving in there. There was just so many American flags all over this small American town, and it was just so interesting, all of it, and inspiring, quite frankly. And so I decided to just immerse myself in the mud and baptize myself in the mud of Shanksville. Yeah, I did that. And my colleague Eric was kind of like, "What are you doing, dude? You just went Colonel Kurtz on me." And I was like, "Yeah, dude, I was feeling it. I was going with the flow, man. I had to feel that earth energy, you know? I had to connect with Flight 93 to take it." I literally took that mud and I caked it all over my body. And my colleague was like, "Okay, now you're going to make my car a fucking mess." And he was pissed. He was pissed. But he was such a good guy because this was organic and it was a documentary, and whether or not we were going to use that that material, which we never did. Um, but it was an amazing experience because shortly thereafter, we rolled into DC, and that was amazing. And then New York City, the day the the NYPD came down hard on it. And what I mean by that is they broke it up. And I was there the night before, and I gave this incredible speech, really, and the way it worked during Occupy, and I'd gotten used to it by this time because, like I said, I had just gone through at that time 32 Occupy encampments, and you would always announce yourself during the speeches where you'd say mic check, and then the audience or the people that were protesting would repeat what you said. And I thought it was such a gloriously uh, interactive way to be able to make sure everybody was on the same page and paying attention, right? And so I thought that was cool. And by the way, I was kind of using that in my mind, not using it, but that was my experience when I was approaching this maybe late 20, early 30 something who had just been the person behind the mask, organizing the 501 protest where I live, and who really didn't want to be bothered and didn't, reach out to me in advance either, because she was busy. Because she was busy organizing the structure of the dialogue to be what the organizers thought important. And it was important. And I'll address that in a minute because this is the most important aspect of I want to put a button on my Occupy Wall Street experience. So we get to NYPD, in fact, that morning, I'll never forget it. The NYPD came down hard on the Zuccotti camp and park encampment the night before. And so all of Manhattan, all of the protesters were in an array. They were kind of like bouncing all over the place. And I think the first stop that we made was this parish that had been publicly involved, that were giving interviews and talking about things that were important from a spiritual level. And so that was our first stop in Manhattan. And the whole day, it just kind of evolved from there. I mean, it was just this amazing, incredible crescendo to this incredible story that I was in the midst of. And in fact, boy, I'm trying to think of the actress. I'll never forget. We got out of the subway, later on in the day after a million things had happened between the time we'd interviewed these guys at the parish and then ultimately, when we were going to go protest at Zuccotti Park, and all of Manhattan was buzzing. And I got out of the subway and I came upstairs, and that movie, The Devil Wears Prada, the beautiful brunette who was the protagonist of that movie. She's world famous actress whose name eludes me at the moment. She was right in front of me and right next to me, and we talked for a moment in between all sorts of things. And so we're filming, we're interacting with everybody at Zuccotti or all over the place, quite frankly, because this march went through all of the corridors that were near Zuccotti, and through Wall Street and all the rest of it. And I remember that the police came down and did with their batons, and I thought there was going to be tear gas and everything else, and they had to bust up the tens of thousands of us that were protesting, and we had to make a run for it, and we ran into some university building, and I'm pretty sure it was involved with Columbia. Yeah, but we ended up doing that, and then we ended up circling back to Zuccotti, and just chaos. And it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, because what happened next was the organizers of Occupy Wall Street had uh, figured out a way to project these images on all of the Manhattan buildings that were saying a new world is possible. A new world is possible. A new world is possible. After we had spent 7,500 miles in 2.5 months, working 24 hours a day, involved with all of the stuff that I've just mentioned to you, among other things, there we were looking at this optimistic, just this incredible people power. And it was so gloriously inspiring. And then it got completely brutalized by the police. And it wasn't a coordinated effort. We found out later that there was state police, it was local police, it was this and that, but it was a centrally manifested deal during the Obama presidency to break up Occupy, because Occupy was really close to the truth, okay? But it didn't fully grasp the truth because, again, and this is how it works, when you have a lot of people that are in disarray and you have a lot of people that are fractured, and I'm sure you can relate this to your own life. You're on your heels. You're not in balance. You're not in Zen. You're not in Fuego. You're not really powerful. You're trying to find your balance. You're upside down. You're sideways. That's why we use those terminologies, right? And protest enables a lot of people to come together and try to find each other and then get their bearings, and then to try to, be able to push back against that which is creating this disarray, right? Now, I will say to you at this stage of the game, that you need to understand my principles have always been this way. That if your actions don't align with your principles, you're in disarray. That's balance for me. That's harmony. That's strength. That's power. I've been in more fights than you can possibly imagine. I've slam danced longer than you can possibly imagine. I've done some real hairball shit where I should have been probably dead several times before I turned 25. I realized once I got to 30, I was going to be okay, right? Because I had the wisdom and I knew how to, work through all the stuff. But yeah, I was a little bit of in the danger zone for a long time. So I know what happens in the moment, quite frankly. Okay. And the reason all of this stuff is important contextually is because what we learned during Occupy and what I learned as a filmmaker after the fact, because my first film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, was prologue. And it was prologue to everything that I found in the con. And it was prologue because everybody had a sense of things. And, most of us on, let's just say, the progressive side believe in human rights. We believe in equality. We believe in, women's suffrage. We believe in, the American dream. We believe in education. We believe in science. We believe in, dynamism. Okay. Now, there's a lot of different sorts of variables with people that think that as well in terms of their ideals of, economics and, functions of systems. And, the smarter you get, sometimes the less you know, to be honest with you. But, that's the idea of freedom and liberty, and this life. You can go through this life trying to learn as much as you can, and you have the liberty to try to go the places that you want to be, to discover and live the most fulfilled life and the best version of yourself that you can. And some people do that, and a lot of people don't. And a lot of people get stuck up in the daily grind, right? And, we're all over the map. We're people. This is the way the world works. This is life, right? But in terms of structure and being able to, respond in a efficient way, if you're on your heels and you don't have the big picture, that's why we have metaphors like you can't see the forest for the trees. But along those lines, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it fall? I always thought that was the most absurd question of all time. Of course it fell. And it doesn't matter whether or not you witnessed it. But the bottom line is, I do understand the bigger picture, which is, does it matter? Well, it mattered to the tree that fell and those that witnessed it and those that may have known the tree after the fact. And if they learn about it years later, but is it important to the forest? No, because you can't see the forest for the trees. Now, if there's a domino and all of the trees go down and there's a wildfire and there's destruction, is there, like Rush said, there's unrest in the forest? Yeah. And I could go on and on and on. But the nature of that calibration, based on what I learned also during Occupy, is that when Occupy taught us that it's the 99%, what took place after the fact, and this was part and parcel to the reality on the ground. There were a lot of homeless people. There were a lot of homeless people that were found sustainment from people at Occupy, because people at Occupy were good, kind people, and they would have these mic checks every night at 5 where they'd try to, go into the bigger picture of why they were there and the 99%. But in actuality, they started to do triage for people that were homeless, which I always found was really cool and fascinating, but also counterproductive. And can you be all things to all people, not without the resources? And what is your focal point, right? Is it to do triage on the homeless? And there's a lot of people that are there for whatever reason, but you know, I think you can understand the kind of confoundry, right, of what's going on with good, kind-hearted, thoughtful people that wanted to help, but Occupy wasn't there to do triage for the homeless. It was there to proclaim the 99%. Now, in terms of the type of people that have the opportunity to go and protest for a long period of time, they either are wealthy, self-made, or they work for themselves and they can do it, or maybe they've got some freedom, they're younger, everything else. They don't have to go to a job 24/7. Now, after the great financial crisis, a lot of people found themselves out of work. And I was hoping to find more and more people like me who had just lost their homes, who were professionals, who basically had their careers rug pulled, and that they were there to try to get consensus. Unfortunately, they weren't there in mass. They were initially in New York City, but they weren't there in mass through all of the Occupy encampments that we went to. They were mostly students. And a lot of the student organizers tend to skew Marxist. Okay, that's fine. It's great to be critical of capitalism, especially when it was clear to everybody that capitalism had just destroyed the world. But at the same time, the question I kept asking, because I have to understand cause and effect, and I have to understand who did what, when, and how to fully, embrace a subject to actually have a conclusion, I had to be in a mindset of, okay, well, if it's capitalism that destroyed the world, how come there's still very rich people amongst us that seem to be doing better and better every single day? Because the way it looked, because it was a housing crisis that was a lot more than a housing crisis at the time. And when it collapsed, and it collapsed the American economy, and I later learned that it collapsed the global economy, but we saw a lot of rich people seemingly getting richer over the following years. And particularly during Occupy, I was asking the question, okay, fine, let's blame capitalism. Capitalism is a problem. Okay, great. Capitalism, late stage capitalism, all of these other things. But what are we exactly looking at here? Well, to understand that, I had to go on this next stage of the journey, which went from the prologue to the actual novel, which is The Con. Again, to remind you that you can find it at thecon.tv. And what I began to learn and what I began to piece together was the facts, I should say, not the fact, the facts that I was able to do because I was aggregating all of this information for the series of films that I was able to put together, starting with Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, and as it bled into The Con, which is a 5-part docuseries. But as it turns out, I have another 5 hours on the shelf easily, with hundreds of hours, if not many hundreds of hours of information on the shelf, of which I turned into a 20-hour podcast. And then that all led to what some of you are aware of, and hopefully millions of more at some point are going to become aware of, called the Clean New Deal, because this is all about problem, solution, problem, solution. What are we looking at? What is real? What is happening? How does it all work? And on the signs yesterday during the 50501 protest, hands off in my neck of the woods and also around the country, as I've already elucidated, the signs were extraordinary. And most of them were about billionaires. Now, the most beautiful thing about yesterday, okay, was that one of my criticisms of the past, let's call it 7 years or so, is that we, as a united, intellectual, educated, progressive, democratic, more idealistic, humanistic, sustainability driven sort of population, creative, by the way, that we have been silent for the most part because of grievances, and justifiably so, in a variety of ways. First, Black Lives Matter. Second, Me Too. both needed their say at the right time. And boy, was I a part of both of them in terms of I had, experienced protests at that time. But again, I'm looking at the long lens of my experience of being from Occupy through this whole movement by also aggregating the facts that became more important every step of the way. And the reason that it became more important every step of the way isn't because I'm important, it's because the story was important. And what people don't understand, even though they intuitively understand, and I'll use this as kind of a catch all, we all know that the system is rigged. We all know that we're corrupt. We've known that for the past 14 years. Maybe many people have known that for the last, let's call it 248 years. Okay. And we could talk about each and every step of it if you want to. Okay. And I'm open to anybody who wants to talk. But as it relates to the financial crisis through where we are, and quite frankly, 9/11 too, that by the time we got to Black Lives Matter and we got to Me Too and that sort of thing, um, you know, Me Too, think about Me Too. Me Too was this reaction to Donald Trump as this kind of like horrible face that just represented the whole thing that millions of women have dealt with really for, the history of the world. It's not a funny matter, but it's gotten more and more organized as time goes on. And so obviously that's the whole point of Me Too. And you think about the Weinstein complicity machine and Donald Trump is another face of it, another vector. And, people were horrified that this guy, as a, literal rapist, would become president. And we didn't know that then. I mean, in terms of actually him being convicted of such, like in the Jean Carroll case. But of course, we realized that later, and it goes on and on and on. But the magnitude of the problem of silos is that when everybody's dealing with the four corners of their existence, again, you can't see the system. And the system, as we all know, as we've seen on these signs, is that it's puppeteered by the billionaire class. That was all over these 501 speeches yesterday. They all talked about the billionaire class, but they all talked like Bernie Sanders in platitudes, okay? And they don't understand the billionaire class. They intuitively understand it because the speakers that were chosen that I didn't get a chance to obviously get in the lineup were people that made sense and were great to listen to. And they do provide a composite, but more importantly, to try to bring everybody out of silos into the light on the same page, unified. And so what I saw in front of my eyes yesterday included a veteran who was really magnificent in his compunction and what he had to say. There was a really compelling speaker, a woman who was, I think, in charge of the state's education apparatus, and she spoke at length and details about, the federal budget cuts and the cost education and what that means in the grand scheme of things. And then there were others. And interestingly enough, they did have one speaker, a younger woman, who was, I'm going to say college age. And she was a member of the state's socialism charter. And she went into the whole notion of why socialism is the answer. But she kind of got cut a little bit short. And I found that interesting that she was allowed to speak because I did see behind the scenes, for example, that there were a lot of Gaza protesters that wanted to mention a lot about Gaza and make that kind of the central thing. And they weren't allowed to speak either. And that was probably part and parcel to the woman who was in charge of the speakers was kind of dealing with a lot of that stuff as well. And I did find that interesting because there was only a 2-hour window that, the whole protest was probably sanctioned to be at the state capitol and that sort of thing. And I'm sure that was true all over the country, right? In public places and the way you have to organize. And the nature of what I was seeing was people coming from their silos, but because I've been addressing all of these issues for the last 3 years nonstop within the focus of the corruption. And that I've continued to reveal that Donald Trump is not the causation of the corruption. He's an instrument, he's a transactional reflection of the corruption. I continue to say he's the red carpet reflection of the corruption. There's been fantastic memes that have been shared throughout social media over the course of the last 2 months. One of my favorites is Donald Trump as the emperor in the emperor's new clothes and the village idiots that surround him. And yeah, there's that, right? In fact, I think most of these things are children's metaphors. It's Humpty Dumpty and the Emperor's New Clothes, but I had from my old days on bad acid. But all of that being said, these people knew that the focus was Elon Trump. Nobody ever said Elon Trump. They just were talking about Elon and Trump. And I could look over 10,000 people and you saw the Mexican flags, you saw obviously, Gaza signs, but you saw tons and tons and tons of anti-KKK, anti-neo-Nazi, anti-fascist, which I was all over, and then some. And then there was this one speaker who comes up, and she was a younger woman as well. And she starts to proclaim that nobody has the truth, that the truth is subjective, that, you can have your own personal truth, you can have other truths that, are important in your life and your experience, but nobody has control of the truth. See, what I found fascinating about that was that here's a younger woman who might be, a very smart person. Maybe she's a PhD candidate. Maybe she's studying politics, political science. Maybe she's going to become an attorney. Maybe she's going to go on to work for the ACLU. Maybe she's going to run for politics downstream. Maybe she's going to be somebody that has an impact. But along that journey, what she'll probably learn if she does go through that journey is that money matters. And that when you have organizations and people are telling you what you can and can't do, you don't have a whole lot of freedom, and you can't have the complete freedom to discover things that you're not in your lane to understand. And so you can't see the forest for the trees. And so here was this young person, very passionate, one of the organizers, who I found, I'd say compelling to a degree. And she was there telling us all that her point was the autocracy doesn't have the truth, that they've been able to hoodwink MAGA, and that, their whole come from that the deep state and, government fraud, waste, and abuse, and all of these things that, bleed into transgender or, immigrants and all of those things that people who believe in liberty and community and are on the, the more progressive side of things because they're human, i.e. going back to my metaphor of Occupy Wall Street, when it got basically overrun by homeless people and they did triage, it was hard to maintain focus with the police coming down on you and trying to help the folks that are homeless. Without a whole lot of material resources, you can't do it. But who are the people with the resources? Aha. And so this young woman who's there lecturing us about truth and that no one person can deliver the truth doesn't understand the system. And I couldn't believe the irony that I was hearing. I was being held out from being able to make a speech to the 10,000 people that are looking for the truth that I'm delivering, not because I'm important, but because I've spent years and years and millions of dollars aggregating the truth from the most courageous whistleblowers at the highest levels of the most important financial institutions in the country and the world, as well as people at the highest levels of our law enforcement, from the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and AGs around the country, that I was able to do because I was able to, as a producer, put together millions of dollars that enabled us the ability and the resources to go ask the questions and do what's known as the investigation. Now, as this person was running on again about nobody has the truth, right? And her point being, of course, Donald Trump and Elon Musk don't have the truth. So we can't listen to them and we can't listen to MAGA. Don't engage MAGA. There was a lot of people that were out saying, when MAGA, because there were MAGA protesters on the periphery and then the cops were there in the helicopter. It was very exciting, incredibly impressive. But the people from the speakers were like, they were doing the Martin Luther King non-engagement, non-violent sort of way, which is exactly what you need to do to get millions of people on the same page, right? Because if it goes into chaos, and I've seen this, like with the World Trade Organization and elements of Occupy, and of course what we've seen with Palestinian movements in, Palestine and Gaza with rock throwing and grenades and everything else, chaos will happen once the violence starts to occur, right? And it's always like right on the edge, quite frankly, when things get this out of control. But, her message was good, but at the same time, consider the source. She's a young person, hasn't been around the block, doesn't understand systems. And I was probably similar at her age. I thought I knew everything. I didn't know it. I didn't know anything. And to this day, I still learn every single day, and I don't know everything. But what I do know, as well as anybody in the world, and maybe more so on this one specific situation, is the nature of corruption, of who did what, when, and how, what it means, and a specific come from that I'm going to reveal in a second, which I've done in most of my truth bombs. Okay. And I haven't taken this long to get there, but I think it's worth talking about because I'm trying desperately to connect with the millions of people out there who need to understand, quite frankly, the wisdom of what I'm telling you, because I've been there, done that, seen it through the lens of this whole thing the whole time. And I've got the answers that everybody's looking for. So the truth that this person says doesn't exist, that I'm telling you does. Okay. So I think we all understand money is God in our country. And money, unless you are completely independent and living on your own in your own shelter, that you create your own food and your own, energy and your own clothing, you're part of a system. It's called society. I don't know what you do in that society, but we're all part of society one way or the other. If we're living on the grid, if we've got our energy from the grid, if we use energy to fuel our transportation, and of course, in a car that maybe many of us financed or owned, depending on what our come from's on, and living in the house and so on and so forth. Okay, so we're all part of a system, right? And there's a way the system functions. Now, in the United States, and again, this is what constitutional civics 101, we have a country of, by, and for the people, designed through separation of powers that manifests the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, that then gives us the Constitution, where the law is supposed to be supreme. Now, anybody who's come from the background of Occupy Wall Street and, of course, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, yeah, we're a little bit jaded and cynical about the law, right? What I've said for a long time is that the law serves up and comes down hard. What does that mean? That means that absolute power corrupts, absolutely. What does that mean in terms of the confluence of human history? Well, for centuries, we've known that when a group of men discover plunder, and I'll add women to this day and age, although they're very, very small percentage in comparison to men. But when a group of men slash women discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. It's corruption. The metaphor for me is the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. And they're pissing on your head, telling you what's right because they think you're a fool. Because you are if you don't know how the system works. If you don't know the difference between ideological truth, philosophical truth, faith truth, and the truth of engineering, physics, and the nature of the law. The reason we have the law is to do investigations, to do indictments that in some cases, in many cases, depending on what the case is, leads to convictions. If somebody murders somebody, you got to answer, I think, four remedies, right? You got to have opportunity, causation, you got to have the intent, and then you have to have the opportunity. And then, of course, you have to put together all of the evidence. When you put together the evidence that has, I don't know, let's say an email thread or some sort of conversation, maybe you have the murder weapon, maybe you have, a cloth that wipes off the DNA. I mean, my God, I have to explain this. This is CSI 101, right? The truth, of course, exists. You can get the truth. Does a plane fly? Yeah. Is the earth round? Yeah. Are we the center of the universe? No. Does is there truth? Yes, there's truth. What is science? Is climate change truth? Yeah, it is. Is climate change man made? Yes, it is. How do we know? Science. If you get into an accident and you're bleeding, and if you don't get it fixed, are you going to die? Yes. Is there truth? Yes. Does a car run? Yes. If the brakes are clipped and it goes into an accident, is there a truth there? Yeah. Does a plane fly? I mean, does a building stand? Does a bridge stand? Does a ship float? There's truth. So that's the most ridiculous thing anybody can ever say when they don't understand truth. They just don't understand the difference between ideology, hyperbole, uh, philosophy, and facts. And they're not the ones that are going to lead us against the corruption that has complete control. And there are others out there that are saying it's corruption and telling you it's corruption, but they speak in platitudes. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about a guy I'm going to see on September 13th, a guy by the name of Bernie Sanders. And of course, AOC. And by the way, AOC didn't know that RICO is a crime. She is saying they're stealing from us and the billionaires are the problem and Elon is the problem. And Rachel Maddow is now saying that Elon is the problem. And Rachel Maddow didn't even acknowledge Elon throughout the entire presidential election until the end, even though I was yelling at the top of my lungs forever and ever. Elon is a major problem because Elon isn't just Elon. Elon didn't just buy X by himself. He bought it with a consortium of buyers that included private equity banks, that included too big to fail banks, that included the sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia and a couple of billionaire oligarchs, among other things. Okay. And by the way, that reminds me, while the country was in protest yesterday, Donald Trump was basically involved with the Live Golf tournament with Saudi Arabia at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, you can't get a more poetic sort of, are you fucking kidding me? To all of the 501, hands off protests around the country that got hundreds of thousands of people to the streets to basically, not be as effective as they could be or will be if we all come together. Now, you got to understand that I do say frequently, and I'm on the marquee of what we've created called the Clean New Deal. Patrick Lovell presents the Clean New Deal. The reason Patrick Lovell presents the Clean New Deal isn't, again, because I'm important. It's not because I fancy myself some sort of guy that's going to become a dictator. I have no ambition to become president of the United States in a unitary presidency. Okay. I'm the producer. That's why I call the producer. I'm a muckraking journalist. I go out and figure out stuff. You know who's Upton Sinclair is? That's why we ended up with labor rights, opportunities during the, progressive movements that basically gave us, the 5-day work week and, preventing children labor so that their hands don't get cut off in meat grinders, sort of thing. Yeah, we have a tradition of doing this. It's called journalism. It's the fourth estate. I know it's hard for people to believe in the era of you know, squirrel bandwidth, and I've got to be here, there, and everywhere, and I've got to do this and that, and I got to ride the wave, and I'm going to get it because we're all getting screwed. But yet, I'm going to lead you to where exactly? Based on what? There's a reason Trump is in the presidency. Yeah, he stole it, and he stole it a variety of ways, some of which we know, some of which we don't. We know through the incredible work of Greg Palast that 3.5 million votes were literally sequestered of minority votes in all of the swing states. I have seen studies, and I've seen some very compelling evidence that there's anomalies in places in the swing states that were impossible. And we know that Starlink had something going on, but I'm not sure what exactly. I mean, again, unless you can get under the cover of the hood, you can't understand exactly what happened because you've got to be able to do the investigation. If the investigation doesn't happen, can you get the truth? No, of course not. We've just seen recently the JFK files being released, and there's all sorts of questions that have come out while mainstream media is saying, yeah, there's nothing to see here. Oh, yeah, there's plenty to see. A lot of it is misinformation and lies in every single way. But I think the sum total of what I saw on these signs yesterday is everybody knows it's a lie. And the lie gets it around the world 6 times before the truth gets its pants on. Yeah, there's truth and there's lies. And what the system of the billionaire class has created a propaganda initiative that would make Joseph Goebbels like astounded of what's been able to happen with X and many other things. And, who is Jack Dorsey and Blue Sky? Trust me, I found a really good um, um, tribe on Blue Sky. A lot of great people, a lot of wonderful people, a lot of the types of people that went to the protest yesterday, and the type of people that I must connect with. But the reason my name Patrick Lovell is on the marquee of the Clean New Deal is because I've got all of the pieces of the puzzle and I'm willing to bring that to you. And I'm more of a vector and a conduit to all of the brilliant people that have given me this information. But I became the repository of it again through my work, the con.tv, the new Untouchables, Patrick Lovell Truth Bomb Rips the Con, and the Clean New Deal. And so I didn't get a chance to speak. And I would have done it in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and I would have just cut to the chase because I would have gotten to what I'm going to conclude with here. But this is the stuff that Bernie Sanders is going to ride the wave. They're going to get fundraising. They're going to be a sort of vector, if you will. And this is what's happened over the course of the last 14 years. To my knowledge, Bernie Sanders hasn't decried the Democratic Party. He's kind of a conduit of people that are fed up, that aren't, part of the MAGA zombie apocalypse, and the sellout Republican Party, built of pimps, whores, junkies, and parasites that are thriving in the dead carcass of the dead American dream, dead well carcass of the American dream. Yeah, Bernie is saying the same exact thing he said for 14 years. And if you want to know further about my credibility, the people that I've worked with were his advisors, both in economics, but mostly in fraud. And Bernie said once Wall Street's business model is fraud. But he never followed up with why. He just got on to we need universal health care and we need to be out of wars and we need to treat people with dignity. And I'm going to work with the veterans. I'm going to work with, the teachers and all of those things that function. But he's not going to do it outside of the government. He's going to do it within the government because he understands the methodology of government. He's been in it for decades. And now he's going to hand the mantle, I guess, presumably to AOC, who, of course, anybody who understood who AFC was with the Sunrise Movement and what she said, that she got brought in under the Nancy Pelosi wing of the Democratic Party, and now she's trying to find herself. But the Democrats, my friends, and I saw this all over the protest yesterday, they've sold us out as well. They're not in a position, even though Cory Booker gave a fantastic 25-hour filibuster, even though somebody recently said it wasn't a filibuster because he wasn't actually trying to stop something specific. It was just more of the Trump presidency. So I think it's fair to say it was just filibuster because he passed Strom Thurmond's 24-hour, 18-minute filibuster to try to prevent the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And he's basically telling us that the Democrats failed and we have to come together and we have to push back. Okay, but platitudes don't solve the riddle. And yeah, there is a truth. Okay? So when you get to understand the sum total of everything that I have revealed to you in the work that I've collectively revealed in this, and it leads you to the Clean New Deal, it gets you to understand four things, four primary questions that lead to the precepts of the Clean New Deal. And the four more primary questions are what were on display everywhere on the signs during the 501, hands-off protests, of which that were steered, organized, funded in some way by, Indivisible and then others, and that would determine who were speaking and who weren't. And that's kind of the thing too, okay? Wasn't completely open-ended. It wasn't open mic day. It was like, we got this thing organized. This is the way it's going to be. And I got shut out and my friend Roseanne got her 30 seconds, which was pretty amazing. But the four questions that I have accumulated and grappled with throughout this entire journey that I'm revealing to you are the sum total of really my entire life. Because you got to ask yourself, are we a democracy? What is a democracy? We're not a democracy. The Republicans like to say we're a constitutional republic or a representative republic. We vote for people who represent our interests. Okay. Is that a democracy? Yeah, it is. But is it of, by, and for the majority of the people? Well, not all the time. And does the actual power listen to the people? Well, no, of course not. That's why we're in the situation we're in. And we have been since long before Occupy. This goes back to the 60s. But yeah, Occupy for sure. Okay. So the four questions that you have to ask to just tee up to understand how you can really put the path forward by understanding the problem is, what is qualified immunity? What is judicial immunity? What is presidential immunity? And what is the Electoral College? We're not a democracy. We're a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses the full faith and credit of the United States to guarantee the mafiocracy that is now fueling fascism. When you have qualified immunity, you have the police above the law because they can shoot to kill. Why is that important? Well, Black Lives Matter knows why it was important. But I think a lot of the country is going to learn why it's important when, how long do you think we're going to be able to protest before Donald Trump moves in with the National Guard or special forces or guys that just decide to start shooting, right? How many MAGAs out there like to display their AK-47s, right? And so on and so forth that they can get without any, background information. How long is it going to be before the cops start shooting? I think that's baked in to President Trump. I don't want to call him fake President Trump, the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid. Is it going to be before that happens? Well, that's a question you want to start to think about and resolve because unlike maybe a lot of people out there who don't believe in the death penalty, I do believe in the death penalty. I really do. But you've got to have all the right information. And I know that a lot of people have been sent to their deaths illegally, and I think that's absolutely horrific. And sometimes I think that people spending life in jail is worse than death anyway. So I am on that side of the equation. But the nature of qualified immunity is that, well, I was going to finish this. If, for example, the cops started shooting the insurrection, at least with tear gas, and maybe a couple of people have gotten killed in the process because of a stampede or whatever else by their own doing, or maybe going after terrorists before 9/11 and shooting up terrorist cells, I think, yeah, the cops have the right to kill. But if they kill somebody that was innocent, that was running away, that was a, black teenager that had no drugs or whatever, that you got to have due process. The cops can't just because of insurance reasons and everything else, just be above the law, because then the incentive is that you can do whatever you want. A cop who cares about his family and his career and everything else isn't going to go off and just blindly shoot somebody if they realize that there's a chance that they lose their badge and their career and their investment and everything else. They got to have skin in the game like the rest of us. That's a perverse incentive. Okay. And we certainly don't want that, but we're all about to face that. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Second, what is judicial immunity? Well, judicial immunity is ridiculous. If the judges are above the law, I mean, they already have, their terms are life terms, especially in the Supreme Court, and I think at the appellate courts as well. And they're chosen by administrations and so forth. And they've got immunity. They can do things like we saw that was exposed by ProPublica's genius work to find out how Harlan Crow was backdooring favors to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who's married to Jenny Thomas, who's connected to, of course, none other than the Heritage Foundation, aka Koch brothers, who were involved with Judge Samuel Alito wrongly. Well, he didn't do it, his wife did it, but flew an upside down flag, nation in distress, which thankfully I saw all over the protests yesterday. And I talked to everyone who was hanging an upside down flag. And I was so inspired by that because I had been all over social media for a very long time saying, people, MAGA just tried to hijack that. That's not the evolution of the flag in distress. The flag in distress came from abolitionists protesting slavery. It also came from naval vessels that were sinking during theaters of combat, I think late 1700s, or maybe it was even earlier. It was U.S. Navy that the ship was going down, the vessel was going down before we had, satellite and technology and cell phones to be able to, or whatever high scope binoculars to see, your ships out in the distance sinking. I mean, the ship was sinking, SOS. Okay. And that's what it is. And I was so inspired not only by the upside down flags yesterday, but the upside down flag hung off of Yosemite Park. And I wanted to talk at length about that as well, that the park rangers and people like me who live outdoors and love national parks were protesting all over the country as well. Apparently there were 1,300 protests yesterday, which is absolutely amazing. But judicial immunity, given the Roberts Court, given Judge Clarence Thomas, given Samuel Alito, given Kavanaugh Kegerator, and Gorsuch, and so on and so forth, And what did they do 6 months ago that we didn't have massive widespread protest? I mean, we should have had more widespread protests when they ended Roe versus Wade, but they they etch a sketched American history by saying the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that says that an American, well, anybody affiliated with an insurrection can't run for the office of the United States, let alone the premier office of the United States, the president, to preside over our democracy by and for the people. They just made him king. And that's when we saw former Attorney General Eric Holder, who I've got a lot of information on, among others, turn to the American people, say, it's up to you to save us from this autocracy, this fascism, this movement, this white supremacy that was coming. And a lot of us showed up. 72 million showed up, which was what, 9 million less than what showed up. I guess it was 13 million less than what showed up in the latest election. And many of those people were protesting Gaza and everything else, and they thought, you know what, we'll just not vote and we'll end up with Trump. How's that turning out for you? But the long and the short of it is, people, when you have judges above the law, especially the Supreme Court, especially an African American judge who was able to get into the position because of all of the progressive movements and the Civil War and everything that happened, for him to become a sellout for the uber rich, and his patron is a neo-Nazi, the billionaire real estate developer in Dallas, Harlan Crow, who has all sorts of Nazi paraphernalia. I mean, come on, people. That's our reality. And there was the other guy, the hedge fund guy, who's also involved with Opus Dei. These are ultra conservative religious, scenarios that have influence in the Supreme Court, which led to all of these outcomes. And so the dream of the founders that Jefferson knew was an experiment, that the blood of liberty has to be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants from time to time, because it's a great organization, or it's a great government if you can keep it, because they understood the fallacy and the complicity in the lack of courage and the fallibility of man through corruption, which has always been there. And I'm not talking about the sin of Adam and Eve. I'm talking about the millennia of corruption that has brought down every empire in the history of the world. And it's destroying us inside now. And so when you have the cops above the law and you have the judges above the law, what good is the law? Well, if you have a corrupt president who's transactional and working for a foreign dictator who's trying to destroy the United States, the law is dead. Does anybody not know that? But interestingly enough, everybody that I heard speak yesterday didn't know to say the law is dead. That we have a constitutional crisis because of corruption. Oh yeah, it's the billionaires, all right. And Donald Trump isn't the causation. He's the creation. He's the Frankenstein, Godzilla of corruption. But not because he's a mastermind of anything. He's just a transactional worm that was able to speak stupid to the stupid people out there because of this sort of formula that's existed forever. LBJ said it best when he said, if you can convince the lowest rung white man that he's higher on the ladder than the highest rung black man, you can pick his pockets all day. Yeah, the formula's been around a long time. It's called the Confederacy, or before that, slavery. You ever watch Game of Thrones? Yeah, break the wheel, people. That's kind of what that's exactly what the American founders did, for all their flaws and people who immediately jump to the fact, yeah, but the 3/5 statute and that they were all learned white men. And that's because the only people that had education at that time were white men that owned property. Yeah. But they also baked in order to form a more perfect union. Yeah. They did their part. They sacrificed. They took on the world's largest empire at that time. It wasn't just King George III. It was the paradigm of parliament. It was the East India Trading Company, and it was their muscle. It was the Royal Navy and the Redcoats. Don't you know your history? And thank God, during the Civil War, the federal government was on the side of liberty and justice for all. And then we ended up with the progressive movements the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, and the labor movements of everything that led to trust busting, and then ultimately into after the Great Depression, which was a major rug pull of corruption that led to the New Deal. And then we had a war against fascism. And of course, our ideals led to the creation of the largest middle class in the history of the world, where all of these principles had undergirded our system to create and enable the nature and notion of public schooling and education and jobs that would create a resilient and a dynamic middle class that could hold its power to account. And it worked for a while. We have ebbs and flows, and we had absolute chaos in the 60s and so on and so forth. But going back to the nature of the law, what I am what I am revealing to you is twofold. And most importantly, what constitutes what everybody is projecting on their signs at the 50, 501 rallies, where they're are all saying the same thing without understanding they're saying it this way. The billionaires are above the law and above market forces. A sort of cultural expression of it was P. Diddy. P. Diddy would create what we called the freak offs in the shadows, where people were targeted and marked who were trying to get ahead and trying to leverage to, become a star. They were basically raped and roofied and raped in the shadows, and that information was used against them to control them. Same with not Epstein, but yeah, Epstein for sure, and but Weinstein. They operated the same vertical, and it was rape and pillage for a reason. It wasn't just a rape and pillage for the human sort of fulfillment of it. It was because they wanted to control people's careers, and they were above them and they could control them. And so the billionaire class has done that to our democracy and global markets. But how have they been able to do that? Have they been able to do that because of their robber baron status, like the robber barons did of the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they had complete control and they were working together? Not exactly. I mean, to that point, yeah, but the world ended in 2008. It came to a complete standstill because the blood of the global economy is money. It all dried up because of the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that never ended. And did the billionaires just happen to, put the world back together, Humpty Dumpty? And did they just happen to, basically pull it all together, and where we've lived the last 14 years, where the top 10% basically had seen their portfolios and their real estate and, everything go through the roof? That just ended because of the tariffs last Friday. They were floated. They were floated by the Federal Reserve. The way the story went down was that we supposedly provided TARP funds to the tune of $700 billion through the federal government to stabilize the global economy by creating liquidity in the system to so-called buy toxic assets, which was then referred to as moral hazard, which was a problem for the capitalist, because capitalism is risk reward. Capitalism, you reward the people who win in the market. Now, there's a lot of problems with monopoly and racketeering and all of these other things, but the idea being that if you lose through stupidity or crime, you go down. But that's not what happened. We used the Federal Reserve illegally through 98 secret meetings that utilized a not very well known statute to the American people, but definitely to the power, where we provided not $700 billion in liquidity, we provided $33 trillion in liquidity. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion to a very small cabal of people in the financial system that constitutes the too big to fail banks, private equity, hedge funds, asset managers, and the list goes on. but collectively our financial industry. We provided another $16 trillion in what we call quantitative easing, which is a technique to lower interest rates for a long period of time to infuse lending and get the economy back on track. That's the idea. But they also were buying toxic assets through the Federal Reserve. Toxic assets that are toxic because they were liars' loans. They were criminal enterprises, racketeering, of which the Department of Justice has the power to take them down. If they do the investigation, to get the discovery, to get the indictments, to get convictions, which we call truth in the legal system. But the Department of Justice didn't do that. I did it. Now, I did it with a lot of people, and I did it with our groups and so on and so forth, but there's a lot of things that have happened since then. But I've discovered more and more and more as I've gone on this incredible journey. And not only did we provide the 33 trillion plus 16 trillion, which is 49 trillion, we provided another 22 trillion in 2019 before COVID during the Trump administration illegally, even though there's a loophole in the Dodd-Frank legislation, which is 12 to 1600 pages of legalese to prevent everything that had taken shape, that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and everybody else in the Democratic Party decided to make the Faustian bargain with the Trump, the Obama presidency, that then Attorney General Eric Holder had made his own Faustian bargain coming out of Covington and Burling, who was responsible for robo-signing, and that's another piece of this, by letting Wall Street get away with it. They met directly with the kingpins, which were the CEOs, particularly Jamie Dimon of Chase, at the Department of Justice to create fines that didn't, they provided statement of facts, but they didn't criminally take down any of the CEO dons, as they are, of the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, which we lay out in the con and the new Untouchables. And I have all of the evidence. That's why my name's Patrick Lovell on the marquee of the Clean New Deal. That's $71 trillion. That's not hyperbole. That's not fiction. That's not make-believe. If you read my stuff, you'll see the cited source material. You see where the revelations came from, primarily as it relates to the Levy study that reveals the 33 trillion initially by tremendous economists out of the MMT groupthink. This guy named Randall Wray, who's absolutely unbelievable. But that's the economic side of it. The legal side of it that I explored through the greatest criminologist that's ever existed in the United States, a gentleman by the name of William K. Black, who gave us the underpinnings to understand how this whole thing works, which we've laid out completely for you. So what we did effectively is we provided tens of trillions of dollars illegally. And why it was illegal is it came through Federal Reserve Act statutes 13.3 that were created after the Great Depression by Senators Glass and Stegall, among others, to create a private public partnership to float the economy by creating loans that would manifest through Keynesian economics to rebuild the United States through the New Deal. But we simultaneously came up with a situation known as Glass-Steagall to separate commercial banking from investment banking. Investment banking is important. It's gambling. It's trying to find new ways and innovative ways and smart ways to create new remedies and new pipelines of whatever we consume, be it through big pharma or whatever the case, military, industrial. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. Computers, technology, blah, blah, blah. But the idea of capitalism, again, to remind you, is if you do something stupid or if you break the law, you're supposed to go to jail. You're supposed to, through the remedy, have all of your ill-gotten gains withdrawn. You disappear, and we start again. That's what the law does. But that's not what we did. We allowed the criminals to get away with tens of trillions of dollars They paid $250 billion in fines, which was the PR workaround. And they all lied to us. They pissed on your head telling you it's rain. But the people that were really paying attention was Vladimir Putin. The people that were really paying attention are billionaires. When they knew they had the Federal Reserve locked up and they could do a workaround of Congress, who has the power of the purse through Articles 1 and 2 and 3 of the Constitution, as we're all now saying, has now been deviated by the presidential executive orders, that they are basically the crackheads with the keys and the code to the safe with endless amounts of crack. And that's what our financial system is. They're a bunch of fucking crackheads. Okay? Give me more, 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 more. Everybody during the 501, 501, protests were like, the billionaires can't buy me. I wonder how many of those would sell out, quite frankly, depending on how much it was. Everybody has a number. I don't. I don't have a number. I've gone through everything. I've lost everything. I've, been on the verge of suicide. I've been there, done that. But I kept going on the righteous grind to continue to pound the pavement and climb the mountain, pushing this boulder of truth by myself, that if millions of you joined me and we pushed it up to the top to push on the other side, it become the largest bowling ball in history that would wipe out the pinheads of corruption, billionaires, to purge the misery of tyranny, to release or create the renaissance of possibility. Money is everything in our society. It's how we organize, it's how we create, it's how we fund research, it's how we solve problems. What is money? Well, it's the collective capacity of a country that can do everything that it does, that of course Doge is destroying. I don't know exactly the end game of Doge. I think Putin and BRICS and Doge and Elon, for whatever reason, at that Elon, guy owns the richest guy in the world. I mean, why would Elon risk all of that to become Spectre, to destroy the full faith and credit of the United States? Unless they had a gun to his head, I guess. That's the only thing I can really figure, or he's lost his fucking mind. I've read, and I've said this on many of my truth bombs, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I know that Elon's a big fan of that. And I've used the metaphor that Elon is, in some ways, Zaphod Beeblebrox. This guy was the president of the Galactic Federation who had two heads, and he was always two different people. Is he the game-changing paradigm changer to, the renewable energy paradigm, or is he a fascist? Well, we now know what he is, but we didn't for most of his hucksterism, to where he was able to be the ultimate government subsidy, to where he had guarantees of billions to be able to manifest all of the stuff that happens in markets and the way it works. And I've laid all that out before. But, he is the ultimate welfare queen, and he is in a position to destroy the most vulnerable, all of which are showing up all over these 501, 50, 501 protests all over the country, right? All coming from their own silos. Teachers, veterans, migrants, immigrants, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, this and that and the other and everything. And yet nobody's talking about the corruption that creates it all. But I am. I mean, Bernie Sanders is, but Bernie Sanders isn't telling you the details because he said Wall Street's business model is fraud, and he didn't tell you what the fraud was. That's what I've been doing. Is Bernie telling us that the $71 trillion truth created this $1 billion apparatus and he was in on it? No, of course not. That's not what he's doing. I am. Me and my colleague Roseanne Rabiel Amile, and then also others that are involved with our journey. Many, which are all over these truth bond riffs, by the way. So the $71 trillion that I laid out for you, that happened before COVID. We've had much more grift happen since, and then we used Federal Reserve Act 13.3 illegally again during the Biden administration. So this is why it was illegal. Well, first of all, I just want you to know that Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary for Trump, used it to basically bail out casinos and ships, or cruise ships and others, the airlines and everything else. They didn't do that through Congress initially, okay? And then Biden used it to bail out Silicon Valley Bank and Peter Thiel's techno bro apparatus in Silicon Valley because of all the runs that took place a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, because of the interest rate hikes and then their mismanagement, because of control fraud. I'm talking about these banks that were also involved with crypto. And then, of course, crypto took a nosedive with Sam Bankman-Fried, and he goes to jail, but now he might be let out just like that guy from Binance because Trump is all things this crime syndicate. And those are the guys who are paying attention. So everybody who's been paying attention to what I've been telling you this whole time are the guys that are controlling the system. Elon, yeah, he pays attention. Steve Bannon knows exactly who I am and what I'm all about. We have on the on our display, on our poster, the big lie, or we were all sold a lie. What did they premise the insurrection on? It was the big lie, which was in itself a lie, right? The lies are everywhere. But again, it was funded because Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was written to save the country, to provide exigent lending through the central bank in times of absolute disaster. Exigent circumstances could be the plague, it could be a war, it could be a meteor coming to the United States. It wasn't for fraud, which is illegal theft by deception, and racketeering is the mother lode of it all. That's what organized crime is. You remember what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said in Madison Square Garden? A government of and for organized crime is the enemy of, by, and for the people. Yeah, and that's what was missing yesterday in all of these protests nationwide, because they want the voices to be heard, as they should, in resistance. But unless you know how the money operates, put yourself in the picture, right? Imagine if you made the worst mistakes in the history of your life. You lied, stole, and cheated. You destroyed everybody. You betrayed everybody. And you stole all their money. And then you lost all their money. And everything went down the tubes. And then somebody said, hey, don't worry about it. Here's 10x of what you lost on behalf of everybody. Do it again. That's what we've done. And that's what nobody knows. And that's what we've done nonstop through 3 presidential administrations with the help of Congress to create this situation. And then, as all of that confluence happens, and it includes intelligence as well, you have to consider the fourth question, which is, what is the Electoral College? Well, the Electoral College is the ability for gerrymandering and all of these ways that through the Jim Crow laws in the South and in the swing states were utilized to basically make sure that the majority isn't heard. And so yesterday I kept seeing all over on signs as well, look, it's the many versus the money. I've been saying that forever. But if you're not talking about how the money operates and how it works to structure all of this insane grift and betrayal, then you're in the P. Diddy dark, getting roofied and raped. And how's that going to work out? And is there truth? Yeah, what I'm telling you, it was all illegal and our system was in on it. And how do you fix it? Well, you fix it with a clean new deal. The first precept of the Clean New Deal is we have to create a new Glass-Steagall to separate commercial banking from investment banking, but with a caveat, and this is the most important one given everything I've told you. We have to say in the statute that the United States, the full faith and credit of the United States, shall never be used to guarantee racketeering and fraud and crime. And that's stupid that we'd have to say that, isn't it? Well, if you don't know how it works and you don't know how lawyers aren't showing it to you or politicians aren't showing it to you, how are you going to know that that's not what they're doing? You're not. Again, that's why Patrick Lovell is the guy telling you this, which is the truth. And the flip side of that is we got to end dark money in politics called Citizens United. How many of you support that? I know all the Bernie Sanders people support that. Yeah. When billionaires can use dark money in politics to create corruption, they hide all this information from you to benefit themselves. Isn't that what everybody understands? But now you have more detail, which then leads to ultimately the caveat that everybody needs to wrap their heads around. How are we going to pay for it? Well, how do we pay criminals that destroyed the world, that took a $4.5 trillion housing calamity and turned it into a $800 trillion global calamity that destroyed the world markets, they were able to give the people that destroyed the world markets $71 trillion illegally, basically for free. Do you understand now why the billionaires have so much control? Because of this. They bought it, the whole thing. And all they needed was the white supremacists who don't know anything to get on board with this insanity so that they could basically fight the culture wars. Do you not all know that? And so, for those of us who understand that climate change is the most important thing that we've got to remedy, can we do it? Oh, yeah. We could have done it back in the 90s. We have the technology to create the paradigm change, which would have been about $7 trillion to retool the energy infrastructure grid. But what about education? What about social for Medicare for all? What about all of these types of things that create a vibrant, dynamic, healthy, informed, intellectual middle class that can hold its government to account and live in a world that's sustainable? Yeah, guys, somebody else put up a sign that I saw yesterday that blew my mind that said, "We're all living in Flight 93 now," which goes back to what I said earlier in this Truth Bomb Monumental Motherload of all Truth Bomb riffs. That, yeah, that's what I was baking myself in the mud of Flight 93 because it is a Flight 93 moment. What are you going to do? Well, hopefully, if you have all of the information, you're going to be able to unite with me because you plus me equals we, the people. It's not because, again, I'm more important than you. I'm not. I'm just the guy that with the information that's telling it to you straight. And if you're a 27-year-old grad student who thinks she understands the world, you don't. And I've got the evidence. If you got to dig into it, you've got to wrap your head around it. You got to understand. And the only people that are going to be able to do this are those who have stuck through this whole thing this whole time because you're like, oh my God, he's telling me the truth that nobody understands. Yes, that's why I'm spending an hour or 2 hours or however long I've been going on to truth bomb about this because I've got the goddamn information. So where are we going to get the money? Unlike what Elon Musk says, the richest guy in the world who was made rich by all of this insane criminality, which kills me because I thought he was a game changer, but now I know he's just a freaking neo-Nazi nerd with the neo-Nazi nerd salute and all of that. That doesn't mean I underestimate him. I call him Spectre, the billionaire villain in Bond films, right? But he's an idiot. He says that the United States is going to go bankrupt. The United States is not going to go bankrupt. We don't fund our federal government with taxes. It's a part of it, but we don't do that. We do that with mandates through Congress. That's why Stephanie Kelton of MMT has been saying the whole time that if you can get 535 members on Congress at the same page, we can all fund this without a problem. We create productive capacity because what is money? Money is a value of exchange. It's a store of value that you need for your time plus, labor equals value. I mean, that's basic economics. But Stephanie Kelton is not telling you what Patrick Lovell is telling you, which that we have MMT, which is just a description of how we fund the federal government for criminals, the billionaire class that has roofied and raped and pillaged the United States and the law because they're above the law and market forces. Are you starting to get it? Because of qualified immunity, presidential immunity, and judicial immunity, and the electoral college. That's the next four aspects of the precepts of the Clean New Deal. We got to end all of them. Nobody should be above the law, and we got to get rid of a perverse electoral situation that can be maneuvered and manipulated by these billionaire forces in a situation where, like, a state of Wyoming with 770,000 people is influential legislatively as the state of California with 50 million people because it's got an exorbitant amount of billionaires because of that's where they can go because they don't pay taxes and they spend it all on influence peddling, among other things, right? And they're probably on, they're in their compounds so that when the world ends, that they're going to repopulate the universe and everybody else is going to be their slave or the world, right? I mean, whatever scientific thing, science fiction scenario, of which, of course, Elon Musk is a part of as well, right? So that's the first, I think, what are we up to? That was 3 plus 4. That's the 7 precepts of the Clean New Deal. But we have to get 13 justices on the Supreme Court that are our kind of justices to mitigate the corrupt influence of the Roberts Court and everything that Mitch McConnell and all of these bastards did to maneuver around Obama and everybody else to get this power to put the president above the king and be corrupt. That is the ultimate betrayal to the Constitution of the United States to hijack the Supreme Court. It's unfreaking believable, but yet I didn't hear anybody saying that specifically in the protests that I experienced yesterday. I saw a bunch of signs, and maybe one or two people mentioned it kind of off the cuff, but it wasn't focused on the corruption of the Supreme Court. I can tell you that. So yeah, we got to do that, and then we got to do what Biden just said on his way out, which was funny, but it's true. You got to end in insider trading in Congress. If they're front running trades and they've got the power of the government to be able to fund things, do you think they can benefit from that? Oh yeah. Are they working up by and for the people when they do that? Or are they working up by and for themselves on behalf of the billionaires that are enriching themselves? It's pure corruption. Absolute insanity. I don't have to say it again. I don't have to, spoon feed it more than I have, but that's what's going on, and you all know it. But have you ever compartmentalized all of these elements in your head? Are there anything that I'm saying that you disagree with? And I'll repeat what the precepts are really quick, just so you can keep them in line. The first is you got to get rid of a new glass. You got to create a new Glass-Steagall, but you can't have the full faith and credit of the United States guarantee this absolute corruption. You got to end Citizens United. We've got to be able to demonstrate how $71 trillion was stolen when you consider that our government is what, $25 trillion GDP, or excuse me, our GDP is 25 trillion, and ultimately we lost $42 trillion in the great financial crisis, and $71 trillion went to, this small amount of people, but yet the federal government is $33 trillion in debt. Americans are $33 trillion in personal debt. That's all part of this whole scenario, but that's why we have the disparity of wealth the way we do. Are there better ways to spend $71 trillion on the corruption that's skull fucking you? There is. And then you get rid of qualified immunity, get rid of presidential immunity, get rid of judicial immunity, get rid of the electoral college, get rid of insider trading, and then most likely we'd have to have term limits to keep the dynamism flowing, to be able to keep the opportunity for America to rediscover itself and reunite itself based on all the stuff that's going on that we continue to learn in order to form a more perfect union, progress just like life itself. And that's where wisdom comes from. And yeah, the truth is what matters. Not the philosophical truth, not faith, not this or that and the other, the facts, the truth. That is the truth. But I will pollinate in terms of this to close with. When you live in light, you live in truth. When you lie, you're depraved. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. When you lie, inside you die. Stop lying. Stop buying lies. When you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity, decency, integrity, liberty, sustainability, beauty, when we all merge in unity behind the clean new deal, that is our destiny to purge the misery of tyranny and unleash the renaissance of possibility. And the core of it all is the law. The law is the only way we fly as a we the people democracy. And that comes if A, the citizens are informed, and B, we hold power to account. And we're right at the crossroads of that right now. We're at the devil's crossroads. Which way are we going to go through this struggle? My hand is out. I'm not the savior. I'm just the deliverer. The truth is our savior. And when you join my hand in Exodus, we liberate ourselves from the misery of corruption. Same as it ever was. This has been a battle that's been going on for all of human history. It's just on overdrive, and it may be the end of the line because of all the problems that we're facing. World War III, climate change, all of the other things. It's now or never. Which direction are you going to go? Well, if you don't have the information and the understanding of balance, can you be in Zen? Can you ride the wave? Can you, carve the powder? Can you be in the moment? Can you deal as a Jedi with all of the evil that we're in the midst of? Yeah. If you've got your North Star of the truth. We are at a moment that might be the most important moment in the American experiment. There's been a lot, but it's definitely up to us because I don't know if we rebound for the rest of our lives, those of us especially north of 50, where we're going to ever see free and fair elections again. Don't forget, Donald Trump stole the presidency by lying, stealing, and cheating. We all know that with the billionaire class to do what? Right away, they took over the FBI. Right away, they took over the Department of Justice. So you got the guns, the police, you got the law, then they got the Pentagon. Okay, then they created Doge. They got inside your Social Security. They got inside. They're going to destroy all of the, safety nets. They're going to destroy people's health care. They're destroying education. They're destroying science. We all know that, but they're already there. How are we going to rip the control of power back from those who stole it from us? The truth. We can only do that if tens of millions of us gather together on the same page, united arm in arm to be able to break the misery of the grip of tyranny. It's our turn. Please go to thecon.tv and thecleannewdeal.org. I pray that you'll join us. Onwards and upwards.